And there it goes. Okay.
Well, welcome everyone to our Spirited History series. Today we have Women's History Month, our American heroes. I'm your host, Leanne Ball, and I always begin each Spirited History presentation with a little bit about myself if you're new here. My name is Leanne Ball. I'm a historian and radio host of a show called Spirited History, heard every Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the ParaX Radio Network. And we highlight historic sites with a spirited past, and we may throw in a few spooky tales here and there. So if you enjoy that type of genre, please join us. I'm also a retired business owner. I had a company that I created called Creative Movement Connection, and I would provide music, art, science, and history classes for their early childhood educators and their students. And I did that for about 25 years. And when I retired, I embraced my other passion, which is history and what makes historic locations unique and what ties us to these historic locations and the commonality from then versus today. I have been a historic site coordinator for 2 locations in Virginia. Currently, I am expanding Spirited History to include programs like today, fundraising events in which we've raised so far $65,000 to date for our historic sites, lectures, and I consult doing historic research. Right now, I'm researching 2 large-scale plantations in Virginia and documenting as much information as I can find on the enslaved history there so that their records are complete. I am just thrilled to be here today with our topic, which is celebrating Women's History Month, our American heroes. March is Women's History Month, which commemorates and encourages the study, observance, and celebration of the vital role that women played in American history. So we are going to explore the fascinating history that surrounds many of these American heroes. The first woman that I'm going to be talking about is Prudence Cummings Wright, and she's during the Revolutionary War period. In April of 1775, Prudence's husband joined other patriotic men from their town of Pepperell, Massachusetts, to rise against the British after the war's first shots at Lexington. While the men marched to a nearby town to intercept the British advance, Prudence organized the women left at home into sort of a female militia. Dubbing themselves the Minute Women, Prudence and about 30 to 40 other townswomen dressed as men, shouldered muskets, wielded pitchforks, and marched to the bridge the British would have to cross to enter the town. There they successfully stopped the British, captured several soldiers, and intercepted vital dispatches regarding troop movements. And here we have this wonderful woodcut print of Prudence and her musket. Here we have Hannah Snell as one of the women as well. Another woman during the Revolutionary War period was Nancy Hart. Now, Nancy was known for various exploits. One of the most popular stories involved her capture of 6 British soldiers. According to legend, the soldiers came to Nancy's home to question her about assisting an escaped patriot. When they demanded food and drink, Nancy obliged with unusual hospitality, all the while discreetly removing the soldiers' muskets from the stack that they had formed in the corner. Nancy had passed 2 of the guns to her 12-year-old daughter, Suki, through a gap in the wall before the soldiers noticed what was happening. Nancy instructed the soldiers to remain where they were. When one rose to sort of approach her, she shot him dead, wounded another, and took the remaining 4 hostage. Suki ran to tell her father, who had returned to the cabin. The Harts and their neighbors decided to hang the soldiers from a nearby tree. And in 1912, an archaeological excavation of the land near the Hart's cabin unearthed 6 skeletons, suggesting that there is some truth to this myth. Another strong woman during the Revolutionary War was Lydia Barrington Draw. When the British occupied Philadelphia in the fall of 1777, General William Howe set up headquarters across the street from the Draw residence and began using the family's parlor for meetings. Because this family, they were pacifists, the British officials didn't really suspect that Lydia was acting as a spy for the Continentals. On December 2nd, British officials held a private meeting in their home, ordering the family to stay in their rooms for the duration. Lydia pretended to retire to bed and then covertly listened in, securing important information about plans for a surprise attack against General George Washington's Continental forces in 2 days. The next day, Lydia used a false pretense to get permission to cross the British lines. Then she informed an American soldier of Howe's plans. When the attack came, Washington's forces were prepared and able to fend off Howe's forces. Suspecting that a member of the Draw family had warned the Continentals, the British questioned Lydia, who insisted the family had been asleep through the meeting. And the British officers, without any proof, had to let the matter rest. Sybil Ludington is often known as a female Paul Revere, to which we say maybe Paul Revere was a male Sybil Ludington, one and the same. In 1777, at age 16, Ludington rode 40 miles through the night to gather her father's troops after the British moved on Danbury, Connecticut. The colonial troops arrived too late to stop the burning of Danbury, but that wasn't Sybil's fault. History says that she was just as important as Paul Revere. Ludington has been commemorated in a bronze statue in Putnam, New York, and there are reproductions in Danbury and in DC. That is extremely brave at 16 to run, and basically you are committing treason by doing that. Another one of our ladies here is Deborah Sampson. Like many of these women, she wanted to help the war effort, but did not want to be limited to just doing women's work. She took the sentiment a step further, walking 30 miles and signing up to fight under an assumed name, Robert Shirtliff. She was wounded twice during the war, one a saber to the head and one a musket ball to the leg, but refused to seek treatment for fear of being found out. And she dug a musket ball out of her own leg with a penknife. After a year and a half, Sampson was discovered, but George Washington ordered her to be honorably discharged, making her the first female soldier to have this done in the United States. Her tombstone is two-sided. The front says Deborah Sampson, wife of Benjamin Gannett, and the back says Robert Shirley, female soldier service, 1781 to 1783. Now we have one of our Civil War heroines. Though Mary Edwards Walker was a practicing medical doctor when the Civil War began, the Union Army at first refused to accept her credentials. Undaunted, Mary began working in Union hospitals as an unpaid volunteer until the Army recognized her credentials and offered her a position in 1863. While posted in Confederate territory, Mary was known to treat civilians across enemy lines. One such occasion in 1864, she was captured and arrested as a spy. Mary spent about 4 months in a Confederate prison in Richmond, Virginia, before being released in a prisoner exchange. In 1865, President Andrew Johnson presented Mary with the Medal of Honor, making her the only woman to receive one to date. These amazing stories of ingenuity and valor only scratch the surface of women's contribution to America's first century. Now we're going to go into another portion of history here with Nancy Ward, who was a beloved woman of the Cherokee. Nanny High was born into the Cherokee Wolf Clan in 1738. In 1755, she stood by her husband during a fight against the Creeks, chewing the lead for bullets in order to provide his ammunition with deadly ridges. When her husband was fatally shot, she grabbed a rifle and rallied her fellow fighters and entered the battle herself. With her on their side, the Cherokee won the day. These actions led Nancy to become sort of nicknamed beloved woman of the Cherokee, a powerful position whose duties included leading the Women's Council and sitting in on Council of Chiefs. She also took part in treaty talks, and that was kind of surprising to a lot of the male colonists when they were on the other side of the bargaining table facing a woman. As the years progressed, some Cherokee wanted to fight the Europeans who continued to control their land and crowd into it. But Nancy, who likely realized the Cherokee couldn't win against these numerous colonials who were very well supplied, thought the two sides needed to learn to live together. She practiced coexistence herself by marrying an Englishman, Bryant Ward, in the late 1750s. And that's how she had her Christian name, Nancy Ward. At the 1781 Treaty Conference, she declared, "Our cry is all for peace. Let it continue. This peace must last forever." We have our next woman, Maria Mitchell. Young Maria Mitchell learned to observe the stars from her father, who used stellar observations to check the accuracy of chronometers for Nantucket, Massachusetts, whalers, and taught his children to use a sextant and reflecting telescope. When Mitchell was 12, she helped her father record the time of the eclipse. And at 17, she had already begun her own school for girls, teaching them science and math. But Mitchell rocketed to the forefront of American astronomy in 1847 when she spotted this blurry little streak, a comet, through her telescope. She was honored around the world, earning a medal from the King of Denmark, and became the first woman to be elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 1857, Mitchell traveled to Europe, where she visited observatories and met with other intellectuals, including Mary Somerville. Mitchell would write, "I could not help but admire her as a woman. The ascent of the steep and rugged path of science has not unfitted her for the drawing room circle. The hours of devotion to close study have not been incompatible with the duties of wife and mother." Mitchell became the first female astronomy professor in the United States when she was hired by Vassar College in 1865. There she continued her observations, particularly those of the sun. Traveling up to 2,000 miles, she would go to witness an eclipse. And here she is with one of her telescopes. Sarah Winnemucca, an outspoken advocate, this woman is. Born in 1844 in present-day Nevada, Sarah, the daughter and granddaughter of Northern Paiute chiefs, learned English and Spanish as a child, in addition to 3 native dialects. In the 1870s, these abilities led her to serving as sort of an interpreter at the Fort McDermott and then on the reservation. After the Bannock War of 1878, during which she showed her mettle by working as an Army scout, and also rescued a group of Paiute that included her father. Some Paiute were forcibly relocated to the Yakima Reservation. She had already seen how the American Indians were sort of at the mercy of sometimes corrupt reservation agents, decided to advocate for Native American land rights and other systemic improvements. In 1879, she lectured in San Francisco. The next year, she met with President Rutherford B. Hayes in Washington, D.C. She became the first Native American woman to produce a published book, Life Among the Paiutes, Their Wrongs and Claims. The work included powerful statements such as, for shame, you dare to cry out liberty when you hold us in places against our will, driving us from place to place as if we were beasts." The U.S. government committed to reforms, including a return to the Malheur for the Paiute. However, in the end, nothing changed. She died in 1891, despite the setbacks she had encountered. She was a forceful advocate for her people, and I have included her today. Our next is Susan LaFeche, and she is a healer. She grew up on the Omaha Reservation. During her childhood, she saw a white doctor refuse to treat an ailing American Indian woman. This spurred her to become a physician herself. And in 1889, she was the first female Native American to earn a medical degree in the United States. After finishing her internship, she started work on a vast 30 by 45-mile Omaha reservation. She took care of about 1,300 patients who suffered from all kinds of ailments that included diphtheria, tuberculosis, and influenza. By 1894, she was really worn down and she left this position, though she continued to see patients in private practice and served as a medical missionary. She also married and had 2 children. In 1909, a trust period that had limited the Omaha control over their property was about to end, the federal government decided that these landowners still lacked the ability to manage their own property. La Flèche felt that the majority of the Omaha are as competent as the same number of white people and led a delegation to DC to make this case. This resulted in the Omaha being allowed to control their own land. Her focus remained on improving health of the Omaha, and through the years, she treated most of the population. She also helped to raise funds to open a Walt Hill Hospital in 1913. After her death in 1915, the facility was renamed the Dr. Susan LaFeche Picotte Memorial Hospital. Next, we have Alice Ball. She was the first woman to graduate by what would become the University of Hawaii with a master's degree in science. She was an extremely talented chemist, especially interested in using oil from the Shalamurga tree as a potential cure for leprosy. Although it had been used topically to treat many conditions for hundreds of years, she suspected that it would be more effective if it could be injected. And she was right. After becoming an instructor at the university, and that she was the first woman of color to hold such a position, she isolated compounds from the oil for the first time and allowed it to be made into an injectable drug. It was used as a leprosy treatment until the 1940s when other drugs were developed to be used. She died in 1960 and was therefore unable to witness what her work, that impact it would have on the medical field. In 2000, the University of Hawaii honored Ball with a bronze plaque mounted next to the campus's only Chamagura tree. Mary Eliza Mahoney. Although she wasn't the first Black nurse in the U.S., she was the first to be professionally certified to do her work. She paved the way for others to get the same education and recognition. She worked for a New England hospital for women and children for 15 years before being accepted into the school's program. And Mahoney was just one of 4 students out of 42 that graduated the following year. After graduating, she became a private duty nurse for families across the Northeast. She continued to work and help other Black women gain prominence in the field. She was also the first Black woman to join the American Nurses Association. And Mahoney also was given the opportunity to address the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses as well. So she paved the way for many sort of to open the doors for acceptance. Lydia Conley, one of the first female Native attorneys, Eliza Burton, or Lida Conley, graduated from Kansas City School of Law in 1902 and became the first woman admitted to the Kansas bar. According to the Women's Museum in California, the sale of the Wyandotte Nation's sacred Kansas burial ground to the U.S. federal government in 1906 upset Conley, who was a member of the tribe. So she and her sisters launched a campaign to protect and preserve the Huron Cemetery in Kansas City, where many of their ancestors were laid to rest. They took up camp just outside the cemetery and took turns standing guards with muskets drawn and put up signs that read, "Trespassers beware," to prevent the sale of the sacred land. Conley stood her ground for years, and in 1909, her fight to protect her tribe's sacred land went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. That year, she was able to put her legal skills to work and became the only third woman and second female attorney and the first Native American woman to argue a case in front of the Supreme Court. Many believe her case, in which she argued that Native American burial grounds were entitled to federal protection, was the first of its kind, too. Sadly, the Supreme Court dismissed her case, but nevertheless, she persisted. And in 1916, the cemetery was designated a federal park. Today, the cemetery, renamed the Wyandotte National Burial Ground, enjoys National Historic Landmark status. Conley was laid to rest in the cemetery following her death in 1946. Zitkala Sa, born in 1876, she was a writer, musician, and activist. She grew up in the Yankton Indian Reservation of South Dakota, the daughter of a Yankton Sioux mother and a white father. She lived within the Sioux culture until 1884. Then at 8 years old, she went off to a labor institute in Indiana, where her Native American heritage was systematically stripped away and her traditional hair was cut. As a teen, she changed her name to Zikala Sa, which means redbird in Lakota. She pursued higher education at Indiana's Earlham University and later studied music at the New England Conservatory of Music in Massachusetts. At the time, educational opportunities for women were very few, especially for Native women. And according to Britannica, Zikala Sa struggled to feel at home among mostly European male counterparts. So she wrote about her experiences as a Native woman in education and became known for her powerful critiques of the forced cultural assimilation of Native Americans in an autobiographical articles like Impressions of an Indian Childhood and School Days of an Indian Girl, both published by the Atlantic Monthly. Zikala Sa wrote books too, including Old Indian Legends, an anthology of Dakota fables, and American Indian Stories, a collection of autobiographical essays. In 1926, she founded the National Council of American Indians, an organization that advocated for citizenship rights, educational opportunities, improved health, cultural recognition, and preservation. Ruby Hirose, a biochemist and bacteriologist. She researched serums and antitoxins at the William S. Merrill Laboratories. In 1940, she was among 10 women recognized by the American Chemical Society for accomplishments in chemistry, and later made major contributions to the development of vaccines against infantile paralysis. Biochemist and bacteriologist Ruby Hirose researched these toxins, which included the hay fever as well, which she helped to deliver some relief for. She had the idea of treating pollen with alum to increase its effectiveness. And this was developed by Dr. Hirose. And she was working on this alum pepsided toxoid for protection against diphtheria as well. So she was not only the infantile paralysis, but we can thank for hay fever, and it looks like diphtheria as well. Barbara McClintock is a Nobel Prize-winning geneticist. She grew up in Connecticut and in New York in the United States. Her family had little money, so her interest in research was viewed with skepticism. It was more important for her to marry, her family thought, than to go after a career, because they thought she could elevate her status in society if she married up. Despite this, with her father's support, Barbara began to study at Cornell's College of Agriculture in 1919, and her studies were where her interest lay. She never married, choosing to devote her life to research instead. She was shy. She was anything but a careerist, but at the same time, she also realized the importance of what she had achieved. And this was her role as an example for other women, that you didn't have to do the norm and get married and have children. You could have and devote your life to a career. Many characteristics of organisms are determined by hereditary, that is, by their genes, which are stored in the chromosomes inside their cells' nuclei. Barbara McClintock studied corn's hereditary characteristics, for example, the different colors of its kernels. She studied how these characteristics are passed down through generations and linked this to changes in the plant's chromosomes. In 1929, she became the first person to identify all 10 maize chromosomes. During the 1940s and 50s, Barbara McClintock proved that genetic elements can sometimes change position on a chromosome, and that this causes nearby genes to become active or inactive. In 1983, more than 30 years later, McClintock received the Nobel Prize in Physiology for Medicine at the age of 81. And the reason why I looked a little bit over here is because I have my cat over here. So if you hear a meow, it will be Max, has made her presence here known on Women's History Month. She wants to learn about these famous women too. Our next female that we're going to talk about is Elizabeth Wanamaker Petrovich. She and her husband just wanted their children to have more opportunities in life. She was an Alaska native. She moved from a small town to the capital, which is Juneau. According to Indian Country Today, they found that Native people were not welcome in that area at this time. In addition, in being unable to own homes in better neighborhoods or enroll their children in public schools, Native people encountered "No Natives Allowed" signs almost anywhere they went, and they were kept out of many public spaces, including hotels, restaurants, and movie theaters. I mean, we just can't imagine that today. Call to action, she petitioned the Alaskan governor, Ernest Gruening, to introduce an Anti-Discrimination Act in 1945, the first of its kind in American territory or state. The groundbreaking law prohibited discrimination in public accommodations and facilities. She also played a critical role in the law's passage, providing powerful testimony before the state Senate at a hearing to determine the legislation's fate. Who are these people, barely out of savagery, who want to associate with us whites with 5,000 years of record civilization behind us? Senator Alan Shattuck, who actually opposed the law's passage. And he said this and stated this early on in the hearing. Her response? I would not have expected that I, who am barely out of savagery, would have to remind a gentleman with 5,000 years of recorded civilization behind them of our Bill of Rights. The bill passed 11-5 on February 8, 1945. And today, Alaska celebrates her Fighter in Velvet Gloves is her nickname, contribution to Native equality every February 16th, Elizabeth Petrovich Day. And earlier this year, the U.S. Mint honored her civil rights legacy by putting her face on a commemorative $1 coin. Mamie Phillips Clark, PhD. She and her husband, Kenneth, worked closely together on some of the most crucial psychological research into implicit racial bias. They were the first two Black people to earn doctoral degrees in psychology from Columbia University. And they went on to found the Northside Center for Child Development, the first center offering psychological guidance and casework for children in Harlem. Some of their most influential work cited the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education case. And it was the doll test that they're famous for. This study, they gave children 4 dolls that were identical except for their skin color. They asked the kids which one they liked best and which ones they identified with. A majority of the children, regardless of their own skin color, preferred the dolls with light skin and associated more positive traits with it. But the Black children said the darker skinned dolls looked like them and they were bad. This work provided evidence that African American kids internalized negative messages about themselves from a very early age, and that continued segregation enforced those ideas. So this was a groundbreaking study where you have actual results that you can quantify and show how this damages a person. Dr. Chen-Hsu Wang, often referred to as the First Lady of Physics. She was a renowned physicist who made important contributions to the Manhattan Project and performed groundbreaking experiments in the fields of physics and disproved the law of conservation of parity. Wu was born in 1912 in Shanghai. Her father believed in women's education and supported her studies. So another father supporting his daughter's education, which is fabulous. Wu attended a girls' school started by her father before continuing her education in physics at university and at graduate level in China. After graduating, she decided to move to America where she could further her education. She enrolled at the University of California, Berkeley, where she completed her PhD in 1940. After receiving her PhD, she taught physics at Princeton University and Smith College. In 1944, she joined the research staff at the Columbia University and began to work on the Manhattan Project, which helped the United States develop the atomic bomb during World War II. Her work helped create the process for separating uranium metal into the U-235 and U-238 isotopes by gaseous diffusion. After the war, she continued conducting research at Columbia University, focusing on beta decay. In 1956, 2 of Wu's male colleagues asked for her help in designing experiments to test their theory that the law of conservation of parity did not hold true during beta decay. Her experiments proved Li and Yang's theories and helped them earn the 1957 Nobel Prize in Physics. However, she was not acknowledged for her contributions, and many felt that was simply because she was a woman. Throughout her career, she struggled for gender equality and correcting people who called her by her husband's name and fighting for equal pay. Despite the sexism she faced, she continued to have a very successful career. She became the first woman to serve as president of the American Physical Society and won several awards and honors throughout her lifetime, including the National Medal of Science and the Comstock Prize. Mary Golda Ross. She was born in 1908 and is a math whiz. She grew up in Park Hill, Oklahoma. She is the great-granddaughter of a Cherokee chief, John Ross. After completing her undergraduate degree, in mathematics at Northeastern State Teachers College, she taught math and science in rural Oklahoma and even worked as a statistician for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But Ross not only had numbers in her head, she had stars in her eyes too. She returned to school and earned her master's degree in astronomy at Colorado State College of Education, now known as Northern Colorado University. From there, her career skyrocketed and she joined Lockheed Martin Aircraft Corporation in 1942 as one of the only handful of women mathematicians. There, she worked primarily on military aircraft. She helped design the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a fighter plane that came close to breaking the sound barrier. 6 years later, she was one of only 40 engineers and the sole woman selected to join Lockheed Martin's new missile system division, aka Skunk Works, the company's top secret think tank that paved the way for space travel. Much of her writing and research for Skunk Works still remains classified, but she wrote a handbook for NASA's planetary travel. It's called the NASA's Planetary Flight Handbook. And after retiring from Lockheed Martin at age 65, Ross made it her mission to encourage young women and Native Americans to pursue careers in math, science, and engineering. She delivered lectures to high schools and colleges. She bequeathed, upon her death, $40,000 to the Smithsonian Museum of American Indian in Washington, D.C. to help tell the ongoing story of Native American people. Marguerite Higgins was a reporter and war correspondent for the New York Herald Tribune during World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. She advanced the cause of equality and equal opportunity for female war correspondents and was the first woman awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Foreign Correspondence in 1951. It awarded the Pulitzer Prize Board in 1951 awarded 6 separate prizes for international reporting. And this was just an amazing feat for her to receive this. The 6 were Keys Beach of Chicago Daily, Homer Bygart of New York Herald, Marguerite Higgins of the New York Herald Tribune, Relm Morin of the Associated Press, Fred Sparks of the Chicago Daily News, and Don Whitehead of the Associated Press. She was awarded this because of her front-line reporting, showing expertise and courage, adding she is entitled to special consideration by reason of being a woman since she had to work under unusual dangers. You know, and this gender reference in the statement reflects the disapproval that she faced in Korea for both being a woman and being an aggressive woman. It just wasn't seen at that time. But her colleagues viewed her as a very brave person, sometimes saying that she was foolishly brave. But she would go out to get that shot, to get that story herself. A very strong woman. Vera Rubin. Oops. I have Maria Tallchief here. Here she is. Sorry about that. Maria Tallchief, born in a town on an Osage reservation in Oklahoma, Maria Tallchief leapt her way to the tippy top of ballet stardom as New York City's ballet prima ballerina. But before she originated roles in some of the dance world's most well-known and beloved ballets, including Firebird, The Sugar Plum Fairy, and The Nutcracker, and these were both choreographed by George Balanchine, she faced extreme discrimination as a Native American ballerina. She was actually asked to change her name so that she wouldn't be considered too ethnic, and that because of her Native American ancestry. And she refused. She absolutely refused to do so. And in the end, she rose above it all. She became Balanchine's muse and American's first major prima ballerina. Tallchief is also the first American ballerina to dance with the Paris Opera Ballet in France and the first American to perform at the well-renowned Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. She received the Kennedy Center Honor for Lifetime Achievements in 1996. And she was that same year inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. If you've never seen her dance, go on to YouTube and watch some of the clips of her. She is just gorgeous, and her legs and her arms and her extensions, beautiful. Nothing is thrown away, and you can see why she became Balanchine's muse. Oh, we have Patsy Mink. Made history. She was elected into the United States House of Representatives, becoming the first woman of color elected into the national legislature and the first Asian American congresswoman. Mink was a trailblazer for women in politics and a strong advocate for women's rights, education, civil rights, and social welfare. Patsy Takamatu was born December 6, 1927 in the Hawaiian Territory. She's second-generation Japanese immigrant. After graduating high school as valedictorian and class president, she went on to study at Wilson College and the University of Nebraska before returning to Hawaii, where she graduated with a degree in zoology and chemistry from the University of Hawaii. She went on to earn a law degree at the University of Chicago, and that's where she met her husband, John Mink. After returning to Hawaii, she started her own law practice, becoming the first Japanese American woman to practice law in Hawaii. She began her political career in 1956, where she was elected to Hawaii's House of Representatives. In 1964, she was elected to the United States House of Representatives. As I said, throughout her political career, she fought for equal opportunities for women. And one of her greatest legislative achievements was the passage of Title IX of the Federal Education Amendments, which ensured equal financing for women's athletic and academic programs at federally funded institutions. She also helped pass the Women's Education Equity Act in 1974, which funded programs to promote gender equity in schools, to create more educational and job opportunities for women, to remove sexist stereotypes from school curriculum and textbooks. In an interview, Mink explained her support for women's rights as thus: because there were only 8 women at the time who were members of Congress, that I had a special burden to bear to speak for all women, because they didn't have people who could express their concerns for them adequately. So I always felt that we were serving a dual role in Congress, representing our own districts and at the same time having to voice the concerns of the total population of women in the country. She became a fabulous advocate for these rights. She overcame radical and gender discrimination to fight for those that didn't have a voice. She introduced and sponsored education acts and established bilingual and special education programs. and advocated for a universal health care plan to ensure people of all backgrounds and walks of life achieved medical treatment that they needed. She served in the House until her death in 2002. That's 12 terms. She also helped to pass Early Childhood Education Act and the Women's Education Equity Act. Shirley Ann Jackson. Dr. Jackson is a theoretical physicist who became the first African American woman to get a doctorate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Now, her research specialty is in condensed matter physics, especially layered systems and physics of optoelectronic materials. She's been a professor at Rutgers University, where she taught undergraduate and graduate students, conducted research on electronic and optical properties of two-dimensional systems, and supervised PhD candidates. She's currently served as a consultant in the semiconductor theory at AT&T Bell Laboratories. She has done a lot of research and work. Her telecommunications research at Bell Laboratories led to the invention of the portable fax, touch tone phone, solar cells, fiber optic cables, and the technology behind caller ID and call waiting. So a lot of what we're using today as technology has elements of Shirley Ann Jackson's work, Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson's work. Wilma Mankiller, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. She was born in Oklahoma. When she was 11 years old, the Bureau of Indian Affairs Relocation Program moved her and her family from their rural ancestral home in Oklahoma to San Francisco, California. As a teenager, she became involved in the San Francisco's Indian Center and assisted and supported the Black Panther Party in the early days, and found activist inspiration in Native American students' occupation and attempted reclamation of Alcatraz Island. So she is a bit controversial, but a very strong woman. Mankiller returned to Oklahoma in 1977 and promptly initiated a number of community development projects to benefit her Cherokee neighbors. In 1983, she became the deputy principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, based on her strength of community leadership. 2 years later, when the principal chief resigned, she became the first female principal chief of the modern Cherokee Nation. She served 10 years in the role, governing the second largest tribe in the United States. Among her change-making contributions as chief was tribal enrollment tripled, employment doubled, infant mortality declined, educational achievement rose, and also there was the beginning of the William Mankiller Foundation, which still carries on works with indigenous communities to carry on her legacy of social justice and development of programs for her Native people. Susan Shrone Harjo. And you might recognize her as sort of a force of nature behind the public campaign and legal action to compel the Washington Redskins football team to drop their deeply offensive name and mascot, which they finally did in 2020. But that's only her most recent fight. The poet, writer, lecturer, curator, and policy advocate has worked tirelessly for more than 4 decades. Woo, to take on urgent issues impacting everyday lives of Indigenous Americans. Back in the 60s, Harjo, who's Cheyenne, and co-produced this first Native American news program in the United States, Seeing Red, for New York station. In 1967, after taking in an installation of sacred garments at the Museum of the American Indian in New York, Harjo advocated for the return of such items to their rightful tribes and helped change museums' policies dealing with Native peoples and Native artifacts nationwide. And in the 1970s, while living in Washington, D.C., she served as a legislative liaison for law firms that fought for Native American rights. But that's not all. In 1978, then President Jimmy Carter appointed Harjo as a congressional liaison for Indian Affairs. And that same year, she lobbied hard and helped pass the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And in the 80s, she served as the executive director of the National Congress of the American Indians and founded the Morning Star Institute, a native rights organization for traditional and cultural advocacy. And she also received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2014. What an incredible life. We have our designer here, Maya Lin, who at 21 entered a competition to create, she's still going to Yale at this time, a design for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., and she won. What an incredible designer. She's designed several other significant works of art, including the Civil Rights Memorial in Alabama, the Museum of Chinese in America in New York. Barack Obama even honored her with a Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2016. So when you go to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., it's Maya Lin who designed it. At 21. Mae Jameson. Oh my goodness. She is the youngest child of Charlie Jameson, a roofer and carpenter, and Dorothy Green Jameson, an elementary school teacher. Jameson family moved to Chicago, Illinois, and when she was 3 years old to take care of their family and to get a better education. Throughout her early school years, her parents were very supportive and encouraging her talents and abilities. She spent a lot of time in her school library reading all aspects of science, especially astronomy. And well, that's right, Max. She did. She obtained a medical degree in 1981. She went to medical college. She also had a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering. Following her, after her receiving her medical degree, she became, in 1987, the first African American woman to be admitted into the astronaut program with NASA. After more than a year of training, she became the first African American woman astronaut, earning the title of Science Mission Specialist, a job that would make her responsible for conducting crew-related scientific experiments on the space shuttle. She flew into space September 12, 1992, with 6 other astronauts aboard the Endeavour. So she became the first African American woman in space. And during her 8 days in space, she conducted experiments on weightlessness, motion sickness on the crew and herself. She spent more than 190 hours in space before returning to Earth. We have another astronaut here, Kalpana Chawla. She's the first Indian-born woman in space. I'm going to go through a few others. Helen Zia, influential journalist. So if you're interested in learning more about her life, Helen Zia, influential journalist. Toni Ko, if you know the products of NYX Cosmetics, here she is. She sold it for $500 million. That was her company. She sold it to L'Oreal. Vera Rubin is an incredible astronomer, and she is the reason we know about dark matter. On a dry, clear night at the Kitt Peak Observatory in the mountains of southern Arizona, Rubin closely observed a spectra of stars in the Andromeda galaxy to determine their velocities. Conditions for observation were perfect. There was heat rising from the desert below, and she was alternating watching and eating an ice cream cone, she is described. And she was developing exposures just shaken by her colleague, Ken Ford, in the observation deck. And it was their first successful night determining how fast the galaxy stars rotate around its centers. And that's what astronomers call rotation curve. And it was 1968, and the motions of galaxies at that time were still mysterious. But she uncovered this dark matter, and she's quite an interesting woman to learn more about. So when you think about dark matter, Vera Rubin had a hand in that. And she's quoted as saying, "How could I possibly live on Earth and not want to unravel the mystery of the cosmos?" I do not know a single astronomer, but I really wanted to study astronomy and I needed a scholarship to go to college. And I applied to 3 places. One of them was Vassar. The day I was notified I got a scholarship, I walked around the halls. I met Mr. Himes, my physics teacher. I told him I had a scholarship to Vassar. And he said, "As long as you stay away from science, you'll do okay." Yeah, you see how much she followed that. What a strong woman. My goodness. Well, I want to thank you for joining me today as we celebrate Women's History Month, which commemorates and encourages the study, observance, and celebration of the vital role of women in American history. I do recommend this wonderful book that the Smithsonian put out, The Smithsonian American Women, Remarkable Objects and the Stories of Strength, Ingenuity, and Visions from the National Collection. And in there, they'll tell you about the women and also the objects that they have in the collection. It's a fabulous read. I highly recommend that you pick that up. It is on Amazon. This has been Spirited History. I have been your host, Leanne Ball. If you want to catch my radio show, Spirited History, it's heard every Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the ParaX Radio Network. Or you can go to our website, spiritedhistory.com. And if you want to know more information or have a question, you can shoot off an email at spiritedhistory at gmail.com. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Ann.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.